I don't want to be special. I just want to be like most of you, a normal person. Someone told me this a few years ago, and it took me a while to realize what she meant. Before I tell you more about it, may I request you all to please take a moment to close your eyes and imagine. Imagine a usual day of your life. You get up in the morning, smiling to your loved ones. You get started with your work or your school. You get back home, have great time with your family, and you end your day. The next morning, another beautiful day starts. You get set to work, have a great day with your colleagues and friends. You come back home and having dinner with your family. And you suddenly hear a gunshot. Within seconds, screams and gunshot fill your ears and terror strikes your heart. You look outside and all you see is people running. And the only option you have is to join the mass and run. Run for life. Run for a shelter. Run for peace. Now imagine the same situation with a pregnant lady, or a disabled family member, or a small child whose beautiful childhood has just turned into a nightmare. I'm sorry to make you even go through this imagination, but this is a reality for millions. These millions are people like us, yet different. These are people who deserve to live a normal life, yet struggle for basic human rights every single day. My mom was one of these millions when she was just 4 years old. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, the number of forcibly displaced people at the end of 2020 were counted to be 82.4 million. 82.4 million. Nearly 26.4 million are refugees, and half of them are under the age of 18. Now, this is probably no new information for most of you, and I believe that you also feel concerned about this issue. But do you take an action to change that? If you have answered yes, kudos to you. I'm sure you're going to connect a lot to the rest of my talk today. And for the ones who have answered no, or who are just thinking that, what can I do as an individual? It's a huge problem that requires government, powerful stakeholders, and organizations to act. You're right, but only partially in my opinion. I agree that we do require government and organizations to support. But a social change is not only their responsibility. I often hear people talking about changing the world, and then they don't take any action because they don't feel empowered or supported enough or motivated to do so. Changing the world is not an overnight thing, right? It's a process. It takes time. Like, for example, losing your weight. Now, if you don't eat anything for one entire day, what would you see on the mirror next day? Probably a weaker you, but not a thinner you. It's a continuous effort for weeks and days and months, and a combination of eating healthy, eating less, working out that leads to a change. And unfortunately, it's very easy to give up. A social change is quite the same. It's very easy to be demotivated when you don't see a quick impact, but you have to continue the efforts. Consistency is key. Let's also try to break down this notion of changing the world into smaller action items in the context of refugees. Well, I'll correct myself here because I don't think there is any small action. There is always an action, and it's probably the reaction or the impact that decides how big or small the action was. So I'd rather say, let's talk about the actions that we as individuals can take to make the lives of refugees a little better. One common way to help is via donations. I'm sure many of you are already aware of that. I remember when I was a student, even 10 euros mattered a lot. So every time I came across an advertisement or any campaign for donation, I always wanted to donate, but I mostly didn't, thinking that at this point I can only afford 5 or 10 euros, and that's an embarrassing amount, and it won't make any difference. I'd rather donate someday when I earn a lot. Today, when I conduct donation campaigns, I do realize the value of 10 euros. 10 euros can buy sanitary pads for a girl for 3 months. 10 euros can feed a newborn baby for days. So please do not ignore the power of contribution that may seem small. While there are concerns around donations like transparency or authenticity, I still believe that it's one of the most effective ways. However, there is more than donation that you can offer. Your skills, hard or soft skills, to help the refugees integrate more effectively in the labor market. For example, take 1 hour, just 1 hour in a week or even in a month, and give basic computer classes to refugees. Teach them how to type. Help them in writing a CV or in preparing for an interview or search for a job. Help them in integrating culturally, like teach them a local language or how to cook a local food, or dancing or yoga, and the list continues. They have so many needs. If nothing, just go and spend 1 hour with them and listen to their stories. Trust me, it's worth it. But first, ask yourself, why do you want to do that? To add a sentence on your CV or social media, or to be a part of some well-known brand? Well, these could be some add-ons, but I believe that it's always more effective when your heart feels the need and act. Also, we often have this feeling of favor or sympathy towards the underprivileged section of our society, and we often label it under special. Let me share a short story. So a few years ago, I was fortunate enough to have an enlightening conversation with a blind refugee. And she was sharing how people behave with her in day-to-day lives. They often offer her a seat in public transport or pay her bills, assuming that she can't afford for herself. And every such kind gesture reminded her of what she lacked every day. The intent of those people may not be wrong, but the effect it had on her was sad. And she said, I don't want your sympathy. I don't want to be special. I just want to be treated equally. Now, you may say that you do treat everyone equally. We all think that way, but think twice. We often do not realize but apply bias or racism unconsciously. We often choose to be friends with people who are like us. We hire people in the companies who are like us. We hang out for a coffee with people who are like us. So if tomorrow systems change, policies change, refugees, migrants, and underprivileged people start getting hired in companies normally, would we be able to accept them and treat them equally? It's a change we need within us. Also, there is a thin line between sympathy and empathy. Let's try to understand this a little better. So, end of last year, there was a huge fire outbreak in the Moria refugee camp in Greece. Thousands of houses were burned, people were on streets for weeks and months. And every time we come across such a news, we all feel bad, right? We all feel, oh, poor them. What would they do? Where would they go? We talk about it for some time, and then we're back to our normal lives. And in a few days, we even forget about the incident and their pain. But when a friend of ours is in any trouble, it affects us. We start thinking of ways how can we help the friend. We may as well feel sorry for them and say, oh, poor my friend. But that is often accompanied by an action. And that makes a huge difference. So we have to train ourselves to think in the latter way and extend a hand of empathy. If you're still thinking that you may not have anything to offer, let me tell you, I have heard stories of small children carrying books to a refugee camp. I have heard stories of disabled people imparting knowledge to his peers, and many such inspiring stories. Each one of us are able in some way to create a space for someone else to grow. Where to start? Well, it starts the moment we stop thinking of the hurdles and just focus on the possibilities. Look around you, and I'm sure you will find someone who needs you. I started by joining groups and organizations who had a similar vision, and I have had a wonderful journey so far with people around who inspire me every day. Before I close, may we all promise ourselves to think of one thing today, just one thing, that we as individuals can offer to make the life of at least one underprivileged person around us better. Can I see those hands of promise? Wonderful. And to remind yourself of the promise that you made or you will make today, choose one item around you. Like, for example, your toothbrush that can remind you of the millions that cannot afford basic hygiene. Or your notebook that can remind you of the lack of access to education for many. My item is my watch. It reminds me that it's time to act. And remember, the last stroke may seem to break a tree down, but it's the collective effort of all the previous strokes that make it happen. So let's break this tree of inhumanity and discrimination together. Thank you so much.